While the lower house isn't sitting right now, the upper house is. And while question time amongst the Prime Minister and the opposition leader is, again, something only for super political nerds, question time in the Senate is for a particular type of political nerd, which means when it's the only game in town, we have to watch it for you so you don't have to. But as you know, when it comes to cost of living and Australians' attitudes to the situation that they are in right now, it is largely one of the reasons why 50% of Australians feel that they're financially worse off under Labor, because, of course, they said it would get better under Labor. It has not. Cost of living is, of course, why 51% of Australians now believe that Australia is headed in the wrong direction. And we learned today via the consumer website Finder that they've put together a thing called the Cost of Living Pressure Gauge. Now, this is from April 2022, when the cost of living pressure was about the mid-60s out of 100. And that was, of course, very high. This was just before the last federal election, when the now government promised clearly when the strain was in the mid-60s that, quote, a Labor government will lower the cost of everything. That was the promise. They won an election. Their failure to do so is one of the reasons why they're in the hole that they are right now. Well, same organisation, Finder, today has just released a number that is close to 80. We're now in a scenario of extreme, being the extreme cost of living pressures. They have only got worse. Since the then opposition, now government, made a promise to make everything cheaper. That is why they are in a world of trouble. But have a look at this for a disgraceful attempt at feeding the chooks, a desperate attempt from a government with no clue about what they think you will fall for as the government doing something about cost of living. This is ridiculous. It comes from the Agriculture Minister, Labor Senator Murray Watt, in the upper house today. They actually think this is serious.
And that's why today I've called on the big supermarket chains to freeze the price of Christmas hams. The traditional ham, I'm surprised that the opposition don't think that's a good idea. Sneering at the idea of freezing the price of Christmas hams.
Order.
How concerned about cost of living you are. Well, the opposition might be surprised to hear this, but the traditional ham is a staple of any Christmas lunch in Australia. I would have thought you would have known that. It's time for supermarkets to do their part and say one thing we won't put up is the price of a Christmas ham. Guaranteeing a price freeze on ham would allow families to manage their budgets in the weeks leading up to the holiday. And I really would have thought that this is something that the opposition could get behind, but apparently not. It's always politics for them, not caring about the average Australian citizen who's trying to save some money.
How low rent is that? Now, that was a question that the government asked itself today. So it was a policy that they wanted to get out into the media, that in the cost of living crisis right now, where we have now got to a scenario where most Australians are in extreme pressure from cost of living, their suggestion is that it's the supermarkets that are all to blame and it's the supermarkets who should do something about Christmas ham and Christmas ham only. This is garbage. But of course the reality is that it is this government. Let's engage with their idea about how important it is, the cost of Christmas ham. These are the people who have increased taxes on heavy vehicles that move Christmas hams around the country. There's a tax that will go up every year for the next 3 years. Then, of course, there is their refusal to cut petrol excise when they have a budget surplus to be able to deal with it. If they're serious about Christmas hams and cost of living, they'd get rid of the increased tax or they would take back the current tax. Instead, they think you are so stupid. They think you are paying no attention to your own life, that the federal government's there to help, because they're not promising to make Christmas hams different. They're calling on the supermarkets to do it, because this is a replay of the politics that worked for them about the former boss of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe. Remember when this government did a spectacular job of taking a public servant out into the public square and feeding them to the wolves, only to be replaced by a hand-picked head of the Reserve Bank who put up interest rates anyway because the situation is getting that bad in the country. These people have no idea what they're doing. They think they're playing great politics and smart alecky games about Christmas hams. When, as you've seen, when it comes to the borders, and now you've seen, when it comes to cost of living, they have no idea. Which brings me to the supermarkets conversation. Now, I am no apologist for Coles and Woolworths. I understand what they do, particularly when it comes to farmers, but that's not something that just started yesterday. It's been going on for a long period of time. If you want to, there's lots of other places to shop. But right now we are trying, the federal government, I should say, is now trying to pretend that cost of living is all about the profiteering of supermarkets, not about the cost of doing business if you are a supermarket. Now, if you are a supermarket, you have to pay a power bill. That power bill has gone up dramatically since this government came to power. If you are a supermarket, you have to get deliveries that come to you via heavy haulage vehicles by trucks, which is more expensive because of the actions of this government, paying again petrol tax that this government refuses to cut. But ever one to help the Labor Party change the subject? There she is, Jackie Lambie, cheering on the idea of a Senate inquiry where the bosses of Coles and Woolies, who again, I do no favours for, but they'll be treated like the new versions of the Reserve Bank governor or the new versions of Alan Joyce, where all these politicians who are in a position to do something about the things that I've talked about over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, instead will sit, point and scream. The media will, of course, fall for the game, and Jackie Lambie, well, she gets to help to try to change the government, try and change the subject for the government that she desperately wants to keep in power.
We've been ripped off for years from Coles and Woolies. Let's be honest, they're like a bloody cartel, and I think everybody knows that. But I think what I find really shameful to the point this morning is that we've got to run some sort of another inquiry to tell us the same thing when we know very well that if we bulked up the ACCC and give it more powers, we could actually fix this.
You know, she doesn't have a private member's bill to do any of this stuff. She doesn't want to pass a law. She just wants to pass the buck because, as always, Jackie Lambie has to be on the right side of the rageful crowd. It's been very successful for her politically, but it's like, oh, I'm not in a position to do anything here. Or why not turn around and say I won't support any government legislation until they do things like remove the truckie tax. I won't support any government legislation until they cut petrol tax. That's when we know you're serious, Jackie. Otherwise, you're just drawing attention to yourself, which I know is the full-time gig. Meantime, this time tomorrow, we will know whether interest rates are going to go up for one last time this year. Now, fingers crossed, looks like it won't happen, but you don't want to bet on anyone here. You have to wait and see what happens. First Tuesday of every month, that being tomorrow, the last one for the year. The expectations are that with the slight changes in the monthly inflation numbers and the slight changes in retail sales, that most likely this thing can get put off until maybe February. But remember, interest rates have gone up by the elbow dozen. There's been 13 interest rates since they started coming up post-pandemic, 12 of those under this government. Now, remember, under the last government, it was, the sky's falling in. Well, 12 of them on this government's watch, including after they sacked the Reserve Bank governor. Well, no excuses whatsoever. And, of course, it's important to note that people are noticing federal government spending. Now, the federal government, while it wants to turn around and say that it's not going to do anything to increase inflation by just firing cash cannons around, by having 35% of the budget being handouts to people via welfare, increasing the amount of welfare that those 35% of people get, it creates inflation, let alone the billions of dollars of infrastructure projects that they're locked into as a result of the states that will increase inflation. Something that the boss of the Australian and New Zealand Bank, the ANZ Bank, had to say, Shane Elliott. Now, he says that government itself is part of the reason why interest rates, even if they don't rise for the next few months, will not be coming down for a few years. The ANZ Chief Executive, Shane Elliott, has warned that Australia must prepare for higher for longer interest rates, with baked-in government spending pressures at the end of the decade from infrastructure, housing, climate transition set to make inflation sticky. Put simply, government spending now is part of the mix of why interest rates will stay as high as they currently are, the highest they have been in a generation, 12 of them since Albo came to power. This is a bigger concern, is that the real prospect is that interest rates won't be cut over the coming year. You have to stand back, forget next year. Just forget next year, says the boss of the ANZ Bank. Think about the next 5 years. So remember, we're in a scenario right now, as we've shown you many, many times, people on $500,000 needing to find the best part of an extra $11,000 to pay off their homes compared to this time about a year ago or before there was a change of government. If you happen to be someone who's trying to pay off a mortgage over $1 million, then you end up having to find an extra $30,000. And that will be stuck there for another 5 years. So yes, good news that it doesn't keep going up, but if it's still at this level, it's at a very high level for potentially as long as 5 years. Now today, Penny Wong was asked about this very situation, including that somebody on $750,000 loan has to find an extra $21,000, $500,000 loan $13,500, and $1 million, an extra $30,000. Thank you to my team. I was doing it off the top of my head, and they've given me the air support with the stats. Look at that. That's the amount of extra money since this government came to power, and it could well end up be that amount on top of what you were paying for up to the next 5 years, according to the boss of the ANZ Bank. Thank you, team. Penny Wong was asked about this today, again, in this Senate question time. And I tell you what, I paid attention, and this is the garbage they're serving up. Again, most senior person answering questions in the government today. Here's Penny Wong being asked about interest rates.
Should Australians prepare to live with interest rates being higher for longer, as forecast by ANZ CEO Shane Elliott?
So you just heard. Government spending is why interest rates don't go down for most likely the next 5 years. This person's response, sadly, exactly what I said this government will take into the next election about why you should trust them when it comes to economic management, despite the fact that your life has become demonstrably worse.
We are committed to fighting inflation because we do understand the effect that inflation has.
President, on relevance, I mentioned interest rates, not inflation, and the minister is yet to actually use the phrase interest rates.
I'm interested in a proposition that inflation is not relevant to interest rates. That seems to be the point of that seems to be the point of that. That seems to be the point of that point of order, is that somehow a discussion of inflation is not relevant to interest rates. As I recall, this government returned a surplus in 22-23, and I know that is difficult for the coalition to accept because they trumpeted the back in black. Got the mugs out, were quite triumphant, but then, of course, didn't actually deliver one. And I know that's very hard for them to accept, President.
Now, remember how they got to a surplus and increased the amount of resources that were being taxed. Plus, on top of that, they were able to, for the first time in history, count the profits of Peter Costello's controlled future fund. That's how they ended up with a surplus. But don't forget, the intergenerational report released by the very same people who put the federal budget together says there will be budget deficits for the next 40 years. So they think because they've got a budget surplus, Australia's going awesome. The only thing that's going awesome are the people that are clipping the ticket, and the people clipping the ticket is the government. The average citizen is hurting. Remember what I said before about the cost of living pressures. 80% of people are now starting to feel the pressure. They will not fall for cheaper Christmas ham stunts or governments that want to give themselves a pat on the back for still having record spending that will feed into inflation and predictions of budget deficits for the next 40 years. Ridiculous.